Everyone, welcome back to another hardware news recap for the week. This one is busy as always. Even with the 30 series announcement, there was still a lot of other stuff going on in the industry, like Sony's PlayStation 5 announcement, which happened to correspond with the review day initially for the Founders Edition cards of the 3080. So we'll be recapping some of the Sony news that came out in the midst of the RTX review cycle. We've got some new information on PC requirements, system requirements for Cyberpunk 2077 and for Watch Dogs Legion. It's actually pretty interesting because Watch Dogs especially has put some more effort into showing the requirements per setting as estimated by Ubisoft. So that's a little bit different. And then we'll be talking about the Corsair IPO, where the company, well, we'll get there, but it's in the billions, which is insane. Also, Microsoft buys Bethesda and NVIDIA buying ARM. Absolutely the biggest story for the last couple weeks. Before that, this video is brought to you by the EVGA XR1 capture device. The new EVGA XR1 capture device is OBS certified and doesn't require any drivers. So it's a plug-and-play solution supporting 1080p 60 capture, and importantly for us or overclockers, it can stream BIOS capture without issue and is more reliable when used with an unstable overclock. The capture card has a built-in audio mixer, it can pass through 4K, and includes HDMI in, out, USB Type-C, console party links, and microphone in and out options. Learn more at the link in the description below. So we'll start off with the NVIDIA ARM purchase. This has been one that's been in the news cycle for probably 2 months now, and it was mostly speculation at first. It started as sort of news stories in the financial press. You saw it in Bloomberg and VentureBeat and stuff like that. And now it's actually happening. And this was something that some ARM officials, or formal officials in some instances, publicly noted as maybe a suboptimal acquisition, to say the least, because ARM's whole value proposition is that it's neutral. It's a firm that doesn't sell first party to consumers, and so it offers a neutral service that you can't really find through traditional companies that would use the service. And it's something that we talked about before might be attracting the ire or the watchful eye of the regulators as they observe from afar. So let's get into the news about this. After endless conjecture about the fate of ARM amidst the news that SoftBank, which was its holding company, was looking to sell ARM, NVIDIA finally announced that it's done just what we were talking about in speculation, which was acquiring ARM. And it did so for $40 billion. The details of the transaction, which will see NVIDIA buy ARM through a mixture of cash and stock, aren't quite as important as what it means for the semiconductor industry at large. $40 billion, it's a lot, but considering the importance of ARM as a neutral vendor, there's some implications here that are future-looking and could potentially spell some, well, shifting towards a potential monopolization in some aspects of the industry. So one of the biggest issues with an ARM acquisition, again on behalf of NVIDIA, is whether or not NVIDIA will truly remain a neutral owner of ARM and its open licensing model that it has right now. There's been already some RIP ARM memes online, and while there's plenty of reason for concern, there are also a couple of things worth keeping in mind. One, NVIDIA still has to clear those regulatory obstacles that we spoke about before in order to get this deal even approved. And it'll have to be put under intense scrutiny during that process. NVIDIA has already noted that the purchase could take up to 18 months just to finalize, so ARM isn't owned by NVIDIA just yet. Further, this purchase will be subject to the approval of the UK, China, the European Union, and the United States. So that's a lot of hurdles to get through. And then after that, NVIDIA is going to have to convince ARM licensees or customers to stay on board. And that may very well prove to be the real challenge. In NVIDIA's own announcements, it's painting a nice picture, as you would expect, and it's saying that it intends to help propel ARM into the future and bolster its IP with NVIDIA AI and graphics technology. NVIDIA also claims that it's committed to keeping the ARM business model neutral and open, which has been critical in fueling the broad adoption of ARM-based chips. That's all nice to say in a press release, but time will tell whether that remains true. And NVIDIA really has its work cut out for it in proving that it's going to be a trustworthy owner of what used to be a completely, truly neutral source. ARM's co-founder, Herman Hauser, we previously talked about, was open publicly about perhaps objecting to, is the correct phrasing for this, the acquisition as it was proposed by NVIDIA. There were even previous suggestions by former ARM employees and higher-ups, such as Herman Hauser, that perhaps a government acquisition might make more sense where the UK could claim it. or be involved somehow in a movement towards independence from ownership. So right now, SoftBank is the one doing the selling. Herman Hauser, the former co-founder, left when SoftBank acquired ARM, and this is where we are. This is a story that is actually extremely important for the industry. NVIDIA is, as we said, I think it was last week's news episode, is getting large enough in enough industries or enough verticals within the same industry at least, that you start to get a little bit concerned about the amount of power and leverage that one company wields in any particular vertical. So this is where, like we said before, it's more than just a platitude to say that competition is important. It's genuinely very important in this industry where you start looking at, again, ISPs who've basically become monopolies in their own fiefdoms and kingdoms across at least the US, and companies like Microsoft, or to a large degree, Apple as well. So this one will be a big story to cover. We'll keep following it as things advance. The purchase has not cleared regulatory obstacles yet. There are many of them. It's possible it doesn't go through, but that's going to depend on the administrations in each of those regions we talked about earlier, and that obviously has a big impact on things. PlayStation 5 pricing and release date discussed this week during the RTX 30 launch. Coincidentally or not, Sony announced a digital PlayStation event immediately after Microsoft broke news of its own Xbox Series X and S prices and release dates. As with Microsoft's console, Sony will offer two variants of the PlayStation 5. They are fortunately a bit easier to keep track of because they increment numerically each generation rather than choosing random letters out of the alphabet. But there's one option that includes an optical drive, and then there's one without an optical drive. And the PS5 that includes the optical drive will be priced at $500. Meanwhile, the PS5 Sans optical drive will be $400. That's quite a leap for an optical drive, but there's a couple other changes too. Microsoft's Xbox Series X pricing, if you hadn't followed it, matches the $500 tier for the PS5 Plus optical drive, and the $400 tier, and its $100 difference, puts it right between the Xbox Series S at $300 and the Series X at the higher pricing. So the PS5 makes no concessions in terms of hardware like the Series S does for the core componentry. If you look at the spec table for the Xbox Series X and S, you'll see that there's a reduction in CUs, there's a reduction in clocks, and there's actually a pretty significant change between the Series S and X, and we don't see a similar type of massive change in the PlayStation options. And we'll also note this too, the Xbox Series S sort of coincides with Game Pass updates and with a heavier push towards game streaming, where perhaps that reduction in hardware doesn't matter as much. If you're going to be streaming the games getting processed and rendered on some remote server and then bringing in the video file later, you can use the local hardware for lighter weight stuff. So the industry is attempting to shift in that direction, although internet infrastructure becomes the arbitrator of whether or not that works in each region. The PS5 will launch on November 12th. Pre-orders evaporated basically instantly, and everyone's way over allocation. So another notch in the year of difficult to acquire inventory for launches. We're in there too. We've been unable to keep a lot of our stuff in stock, even though we're doing bigger orders than we've ever done. And people are just buying a lot right now. It's Black Friday order volume for these computer components and entertainment components basically since March, which is unprecedented. NVIDIA moving away from SLI support in an official capacity, but it has plans to change things, and that's with the arrival of the RTX 30 series. There was the somewhat maybe surprising revelation that NVIDIA was only planning to support SLI on the RTX 3090. And this was sort of reminiscent of what you saw AMD do with the CPU side, where in earlier generations with Threadripper, there were the sub $1,000 options, like $700, $800 options for Threadripper, where you basically got a lot of PCIe lanes for really cheap, comparatively, of course. And then the 3950X came out, and you get Threadripper type of cores and performance, but you don't get the PCIe lane assignment, you don't get the same memory bandwidth, and it sort of segmented the market where now the entry level, if you wanted that more workstation targeted lane count and bandwidth, you had to go up to over $1,000 for the higher end parts. So we're seeing something similar with the RTX series, where users who are more likely to be professional users are, if they need multiple cards that specifically use a bridge, they'll have to go to the 3090s. as opposed to buying an $800 or $700 card and bridging them together to get higher tier performance. Now that said, a lot of applications like Blender Cycles, rendering for example, will work without a bridge just fine because the tiles will process independently. They don't need to communicate. There's no AFR or anything like that for a lot of rendering applications. But if you need the bridge for workloads in which the GPUs will communicate to each other directly, then that is now priced a tier higher, with the 3080 losing multi-GPU support in an official capacity. However, it seems that NVIDIA is attempting to trim SLI support in favor of supposedly helping developers leverage a native implementation at the API level, rather than through these sort of profiles and hackery that we've seen in the past. NVIDIA calls this, quote, transitioning to native game integrations. And it says, quote, NVIDIA will no longer be adding new SLI driver profiles on the RTX 20 series and earlier GPUs starting on January 1st, 2021. Instead, we will focus on supporting developers to implement SLI natively inside the games. We believe this will provide the best performance for SLI users, end quote. So that's what NVIDIA says about the future of SLI support. A couple of other notes here. NVIDIA maintains that it will still test and update its SLI profiles for SLI-ready RTX 20 and earlier GPUs, which are not already on the EOL list anyway. And as for the RTX 3090 and future SLI-capable GPUs, NVIDIA says that SLI will only be supported if it's baked into the game natively. NVIDIA will be working with developers on both DX12 and Vulkan support for SLI natively within their games. And additionally, non-gaming applications that make use of SLI without the use of SLI drivers will continue to work as usual. If you don't recall, or you maybe weren't paying attention back when this was a big story previously, back with Ashes of the Singularity, there were a lot of news stories about explicit multi-GPU and the ability of these newer APIs, like DirectX 12 and Vulkan, to support explicit multi-GPU through the PCIe interface rather than through a bridge. This was actually a big breakthrough, and it allowed for some interesting content and academic research, which is specifically phrased as such because Ashes wasn't a game that many people played. If you did, cool, but not many people got to experience it. And some of the things that you could do was combine GPUs that weren't even compatible with each other in a traditional SLI sense. So you could combine, and we did this, an AMD and an NVIDIA GPU, and you could use them to process the game and play with multi-GPU via PCIe with no bridge between them. It was really cool. It tested pretty well overall, but that particular implementation was explicitly built by the Ashes team as a showcase of the technology. And after that, we didn't really see much follow through in other games. Our understanding is that it's not particularly easy to add this to the games, so developers haven't pursued it for the most part. It's also uncommon to have some of these mixed GPU usages in a single system, especially cross-brand. But if this is the direction that NVIDIA hopes to go, perhaps there's a chance that multi-GPU will find new life if it's able to leverage the additional bandwidth of the PCIe 4 interface, which we've just shown is not particularly constraining for a single GPU. It may be able to leverage that extra bandwidth to do explicit multi-GPU or other forms of multi-GPU without a bridge, without needing the extra bandwidth provided by a link between them. So anyway, that's what it sounds like NVIDIA is hoping to do. We'll see how much follow-through there is on the developer side. Support for multi-GPU is always kind of mixed because you're asking these strained developers who are already building for a million possible configurations to then add multi-GPU for a very small subsection of the market. But multi-GPU is cool, so hopefully it works out. Up next, DigiTimes and TSMC's 5nm capacity getting claimed. A recent DigiTimes report indicated that TSMC's 5nm process has been fully claimed by customers through end of year 2020. TSMC says that Apple has claimed most of the supply, and DigiTimes reports that the ghost of Joe is still here. Actually, Joe is here. He's waiting to do some work on the CPUs. Okay, TSMC says that Apple has claimed most of the supply, and DigiTimes reports that this is aligned with iPad Air and iPhone orders. TSMC is also busy with 7nm manufacturing right now, where it's dealing with heavy AMD order volume for its CPUs, its new RDNA 2 GPUs, and for semi-custom SoC orders for the PlayStation 5 and Xbox game consoles. Right now, TSMC is absolutely slammed with orders, and it recently talked about its, was it 1 billionth wafer that came off the line for 7nm. So the company has, TSMC that is, has reported an increase in 7nm yield and maturity to where the process is now reliable enough that the yields are higher, the waste is lower, and so they're able to output more 7nm volume, but also at least maintain the existing price structure, if not reduce it in some instances. We don't know the partner agreements, the customer agreements, but that's where they are now. 5nm is already getting claimed for production purposes, though. Up next, Oracle and its weird TikTok deal. In technology news, Oracle, which is, as we understand it, one of the most hated companies in the world if you talk to developers. Certainly Wendell from Level 1 Techs has stories about Oracle. Oracle seems to have won the bidding war for the social network and spiritual Vine successor, TikTok, which we don't understand still. But Microsoft was widely considered to have been the favorite here, the chosen one to assume control over TikTok. And Microsoft wasn't shy about its interest in acquiring the company either. Microsoft buying TikTok was a bit odd on its own, but Oracle acquiring it is especially odd. We can't really call this an acquisition, which is what Microsoft was pursuing. According to the details, which are scarce at the moment, Oracle will become a, what's the exact phrase they use? Quote, trusted tech partner. If someone could tell us what trusted tech partner means, that would be great. We'll take trusted tech partner for 800, please. Reading between the lines of it, this suggests that Oracle will be using its own infrastructure to host and manage TikTok's US operations, which has been a point of contention in the US-China trade conflict. Essentially, Oracle just became a really expensive babysitter to enable this. The concern with TikTok has been its Chinese parent company, ByteDance, and security issues stemming from US user data being subject to being seized by the Chinese government. This is something ByteDance has attempted to refute, but the fear of Chinese espionage has only grown out of this story. Had Microsoft won the bid for TikTok's US operations, it would have, allegedly, it claims, severed the US user base from any foreign servers. But Microsoft would have also overhauled TikTok's source code in the process of the acquisition and redeployment to the US user base. And just to be clear here, we are not making any political commentary on the story, just reporting the technical news as it relates to the wider geopolitical landscape without making any commentary. So do with that what you will. Watch Dogs Legion PC requirements and Cyberpunk as well coming up next. Ubisoft has released the minimum requirements and recommended configurations for its upcoming Watch Dogs Legion PC game, including sections split into RT off and RT on columns. This is a new trend we've seen. The specs listing goes into more detail than most and identifies the 7700K and R5 2600 as the recommended parts for 1440p with high settings and RT off. It goes down to the 4000 SKU for one tick lower, or if you go a tick up, the 3700X or 9700K for ultra settings. The company identified the 2060 Super and the RX 5700 non-XT as most appropriate for 1440p high, encouraging 8 gigabytes of video memory. The game also calls for an almost low 45 gigabytes of storage, at least compared to Call of Duty and other recent titles that are over 100 gigabytes. But Ultra marks an additional 20 gigabytes for an HD texture pack, which is optional. As for the 11 gigabyte recommendation jumping out at 4K Ultra, keep in mind that this may be on the high side, especially since they're demarcating a 2080 Ti in this listing. And the higher speed GDDR6X memory may account for the delta in memory capacity between the devices, the 3080 and the 2080 Ti, to the extent that an extra 1 gigabyte may not matter at all. And also, the recommendations and requirements as posted by game makers are often more on the conservative side than not. So that's what we have right now. It's interesting to see the RT on and off columns for sure. That's definitely new. But this one we may not follow as closely. It just depends on the level of interest. If you're interested in Watch Dogs Legions or not interested in Watch Dogs Legion, we'd love to hear about it in the comments, because we'll have to at some point figure out if we want to add it to our benchmarks or if people just don't care that much. So let us know what you think about it below. Same for Cyberpunk, by the way, which is the next story. Cyberpunk 2077 posted its own PC requirements, and barring any additional delays, Cyberpunk is supposed to arrive in November. CD Projekt Red is making its system requirements available with a tweet for the Cyberpunk 2077 Twitter account, and overall it seems that the Neon Night City isn't going to be asking too much in terms of basic hardware. The minimum requirements list 64-bit Windows 10 or Windows 7, It interestingly, or potentially conflictingly, lists DirectX 12 as required, Intel Core i5 3570K, or an AMD FX 8310, shockingly, 8 gigabytes of system memory, a GTX 780 3 gigabyte, or AMD RX 470, 70 gigabytes of storage, and the recommended configuration is 64-bit Windows 10, DX12, 4790 non-K from Intel, or an R3 3200G, 12 gigabytes of memory, and the NVIDIA 1060 6 gigabyte or AMD R9 Fury. And for this one, it's also suggesting 70 gigabytes of storage available. So regardless of system, Cyberpunk 2077 will demand a hefty 70 gigabytes of installation media. The recommended specs call for an SSD specifically. Not too surprising, the load times on a game like this may become painful without one, but we'd obviously have to test it to verify. And the game, in the very least, should be fun to benchmark and test later this year, because there are a lot of graphics options that we're aware of going in there. And if it's anything like The Witcher 3, benchmarking should have plenty of avenues to explore from purely a technology standpoint. Even if you don't care about this game, the coverage should be interesting, because we may learn a few new things about how different GPUs or CPUs perform relative to whatever game settings are exposed to the users. So that'll be fun to play around with. Also, we judged a Cyberpunk case mod contest, so that's up on one of their social media channels somewhere. It should be on YouTube. But basically, we talked about their Cyberpunk case mod contest previously. Insanely talented case modders submitted stuff to the contest. The theme was, I think it was the future is reusable or something to that extent. And case modders had to figure out how to make a case that was themed in a cyberpunk fashion. And we did our own, of course, but we're not actually good modders. And the real modders, like to all of you out there who contributed, phenomenal work, because Cyberpunk sent a list. They just asked me, will you provide some feedback on what you think of these mods? And it wasn't a sponsored exchange or anything, it was just fun. And they sent us a list in Excel of, I think it was maybe 50 configurations with like 3 images each and videos and everything. So impressive. It was really hard to pick between them. We'll show a few of them on the screen. The winners were all phenomenal, though. So to the case modders out there who worked on these, your work is very impressive and inspiring to see. And I will never be able to achieve anything like it, because that's not what we do. But good work by the modders, and kind of a fun contest if you want to see. If you're interested in the idea of making your computer more like art, it might be a fun place to get some inspiration for for what you could do with a case if you are particularly talented. But it might give you ideas for a more, we'll call it, enterprising way to do things as well. Corsair's IPO. We recently reported on Corsair looking to go public with an IPO. And we now have an idea of what that IPO is worth. According to multiple reports, Corsair, which will trade under CRSR, unfortunately not Pirate or Sales, which would have been the best one. SAILS would have been perfect for Corsair. It will initially offer $252 million worth of shares. Allegedly, it's valued apparently at $1.65 billion. And its IPO, Corsair will offer 14 million shares, priced between $16 and $18 per share. The shares are split between Corsair at $7.5 million and initial shareholders for $6.5 million. And then Corsair will reportedly have 91,849,366 shares left outstanding after its IPO. We'll watch this story, as we often do for all of these, as it develops. It's a financial story, so it's not as interesting to us in the core of what we do, but it's kind of insane that Corsair has become the company it has. It has had some really strong products in memory. It had initial strong products in cases. That's fallen off significantly over the years, but hopefully with the new ones that just came out, we'll test them and see if they've returned. But ultimately, it's just sort of gotten its hands into everything, or at least its sticker onto everything at some point. And so this is where it is now. And our last story for this week, Microsoft's Xbox.com page announced that it is acquiring Bethesda via an acquisition of the parent company ZeniMax. Bethesda is best known for its Elder Scrolls series, but is also known for Doom, Dishonored, and Quake, and employs 2,300 staff members who will now be under a different parent company. Microsoft explicitly mentioned that it would be adding Bethesda's seminal titles into Game Pass, which it's been pushing increasingly for Xbox and PC lately. Microsoft claims that it will still allow Bethesda to follow through with development of titles for PS5 exclusively for now, including Deathloop and Ghostwire Tokyo. In the future, though, Microsoft says that this will be done on a case-by-case basis. We would assume that all cases will be, no, you can't do that, but they'll at least allegedly decide case by case. The acquisition cost Microsoft $7.5 billion. The deal should be complete by June of next year, and Microsoft, if you aren't aware, is no stranger to such large acquisitions of game companies because it spent a couple $2 billion on Minecraft previously. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly or patreon.com/gamersnexus, and we'll see you all next time.